Howdy, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about World War II, specifically the European theater. We're going to go through this kind of quick because there's a lot to cover, but let's dive in. So, starting of the war kind of kicked off in earnest when the German troops invaded Poland. Now, the war was against Germany, even though Russia also invaded Poland and took part of the Polish territory. But oddly enough, actually, Russia's going to come in on the side of the Allies when Germany betrays their non-aggression pact. Now, this is going to be, as one historian put it, the largest single event in human history. At least 400,000 Americans died in battle, and 670,000 more were wounded in the fighting. However, the Soviets are going to have it the worst. They lost 21 million troops. And this blitzkrieg, like we talked about in the earlier lecture, is going to be this rapid attack, this lightning style war where the Germans push through and overrun France's defensive lines before the French can even really muster a full response. The British tried to send an expeditionary force to help aid the French, but very quickly the French lines fell and the British will be isolated with a few French troops. Now, in the interwar period between World War I and World War II, France had built what's called the Maginot Line. So this red line, solid one, is strong fortifications. And then you had kind of weak fortifications. And France's goal was, if another war with Germany broke out, to have that war be fought in Belgium, not in France. Unfortunately, Germany overran Belgium and broke through the French weak fortifications too rapidly, and the French fell back. And this is what leads to a battle or period of time called Dunkirk. This is when the Germans swung around and isolated the British and the French, so in kind of this red shaded area on the outskirts of Dunkirk, and slowly began surrounding. The only thing that saved the troops at Dunkirk was a massive effort by the British Navy and many ships from England to come help these troops escape. About 300,000 British and French troops and forces managed to retreat back to the home islands. So this is a major effort to get these people back, to help get them off the continent so they can keep fighting from England. But this also meant these were kind of the last major defenders of France. And France capitulated and surrendered to Germany. So in blue, you have kind of what's called the Free Zone, which is also known as Vichy France. And basically, while they're not actively occupied by the Germans, they're under German kind of rule. So the Germans can kind of dictate what goes on in those areas. Now, the yellow area is under active German control. And you see along red, that's kind of the Atlantic wall that the Germans are beginning to build over much of this coastline, a defense, particularly on the northern coast along the English Channel, to prevent a counterattack or invasion from England. Once they conquered France, Germany began a bombardment of England, trying to basically bomb them into submission and used submarines to sink any ships trying to resupply and offer aid to England. Now, those ships often took the shape and form of American ships because we were beginning to send supplies and shipping to England to try to keep them in the war. We were not in the war, but we really didn't like the idea of Hitler winning and England being wiped out either. So you can see these are propaganda posters drawn by Dr. Seuss. So even Dr. Seuss got in on the war. Now, kind of the more official program, right before we joined the war, was the LendLease Act. Basically, we're going to lend or lease tanks, trains, trucks, supplies, weapons, guns, artillery, anything we can imagine to all of our allies. So mainly England, Russia, and China, with the idea that after the war, they'll pay back that debt. Now, to give you an idea of how much debt is going to be accrued towards the United States, it took England until the late 1900s, about late 1980s, early 1990s, to fully pay back that debt. So this is a massive debt incurred by the rest of the world as a result of World War II. Right around the same time, you have the Tripartite Pact. This is when the Japanese, the Germans, and the Italians create a three-part alliance, saying that they will ally together. Now, there's a big difference between the Tripartite Pact and the Allied powers in one key feature. The Allies will always work in conjunction with each other. So, England, the United States, and France often worked in close tandem with each other, and to a lesser degree Russia, they at least communicated with Russia what the plans were, while Germany and Japan in particular, but also Italy, kind of just did their own thing and never really worked together towards a common goal. They just basically were agreeing not to fight each other. But ultimately, this is going to be one of the big downfalls of the Axis powers, it's another name for the Tripartite Pact, is because there's no cooperation, no clear goal for them. Now, Italy had grand ideas, grand plans. They were going to rebuild the old Roman Empire. And that meant taking over parts of northern Africa, taking some other territories and islands. The problem was the Italian army wasn't particularly great during World War II. The machinery and tanks they were using wasn't ideal. The military wasn't perfectly trained. There was a lot of problems. And the Italians will very quickly overextend themselves, and the Germans will have to come bail them out. So this means that Germany is having to come to North Africa and fight and take part in battles that it didn't really want. So it's sapping a lot of resources from the Germans. At the same time that they're getting distracted with Italy, Germany decides to betray Russia, ignore that non-aggression pact, and invade Russia. Now, this is one of the single worst decisions made by the Germans during the war, because one, it brings Russia into the war on the side of the Allies, and two, Russia is a big country, and you have to be prepared to fight in winter, which the Germans were not. Now, at the same time that all this is going on, Japan is getting ready to make a move. Because keep in mind, Russia had just been brought into the war, but the United States still was not in the war. Now, if you see this red line that's surrounding a big chunk of kind of Southeast Asia and mainland Asia, this is what Japan thought it needed to control in order to be completely and utterly self-sufficient. So autonomous and had all the resources and supplies they needed. The problem was many of these islands were controlled by England, France, China, the United States, New Zealand, Australia, all these other groups. Primarily, the big interest was going to be for places like the Philippines, which are controlled by the United States. This means if they want to take this, there's going to be war with the United States. So, this is the big thing. While you're having war raging in Europe, the Japanese are beginning to consider bringing the United States into this big war. Now, if we look at this map here, basically everything in blue was the maximum reach of German control at one point, so at the height of the war. So this is a pretty big level of conquest. This is probably in modern era in the 1900s, the most any one country has ever conquered of foreign powers. In Northern Africa, you're going to have kind of the first major counterattacks against the Germans. And this is kind of a practice run for invading Europe proper. So they're going to practice in North Africa to fight the Germans that are fighting with the Italians, to kind of practice, figure things out, figure out army coordination to prepare a much bigger invasion for France. And by this point, the United States, after Pearl Harbor, has decided to join. So here's FDR meeting with Winston Churchill from England. They are talking, trying to figure out a plan of action, what they're going to do. The first big effort by the United States in North Africa is going to be the Battle of Casablanca Pass, where the United States thoroughly gets its ass kicked. But when Rommel, the German general, sees what the Americans were willing to abandon in their retreat, it has him concerned because he's looking around saying, okay, if the Americans can just abandon all these resources, that means they're not afraid of getting more. That means they have access to more resources. And then Rommel is looking at his own and saying, okay, we're at our resource limit. Like, we can't do much more than what we already are doing. But the Americans are just beginning to ramp up their efforts. So that was the real fear of the United States. Just like in World War I, it was our supply network, our ability to produce things. That was the true fear more than the army itself. Although our army would prove to be a force to be reckoned with during the Second World War. But the Battle of Casablanca Pass was a bit of an embarrassment for the United States. Now at the Casablanca Conference in early 1943, so the British and Americans agreed to continue to press the Mediterranean advance through Sicily and up the Mediterranean supply routes. And the British wanted to go into the Balkans and Turkey. But the Russians are requesting aid. The Russians need help. They need a second front in Europe. And the Russians are getting hit hard, particularly at the city of Stalingrad in the southern part of Russia. Winter has set in, and at Stalingrad, more than 2 million Russians will die, with about 800,000 Germans dying. Now, the one resource the Russians had over the Germans was manpower. And basically, they stopped this massive German army by gumming up the works with human bodies, just literally throwing wave after wave of soldier. Many of the soldiers, the first one would get a rifle, the second one would get bullets, and when the first one died, next one picked up the gun and reloaded and kept fighting because they didn't have enough guns for everybody. So this is a bloody, bloody battle. But by the end, Stalingrad turns to a victory for the Russians and they begin a counterattack. This is where you get interesting stories like Maria, where she loses her husband in the war. So she sells everything she has, gives it to the government, says, I want to buy a tank. And she learns to be a tank commander, and she names her tank, what translates to the fighting girlfriend. And she actually leads her tank crew in fighting the Germans. So you have these interesting stories, but the Russian people really get behind this war and they really begin a counterattack and slowly begin pushing the Germans out of Russia. And this is when the biggest invasion is planned. So here you have Eisenhower, the American general, you have Winston Churchill, the British leader, and you have Charles de Gaulle, the French leader, or the French general, planning the biggest invasion in human history. This is going to be the D-Day invasion at Normandy. So it's going to be primarily American, French, or American, British, and Canadian troops landing on the Normandy coast, in the part of Normandy, France. Now, Gold, Juno, and Sword, the landings were rough. There was some fighting, but it wasn't too bad. Utah landed. It was rough. There was a lot of fighting. It was at Omaha that we saw truly catastrophic fighting. They met some of the staunchest defenders and some of the heaviest defenses that were built along Omaha Beach. And it was a bloody fight that the Americans had to slog through. And these guys are landing in relatively lightweight landing craft. And they're having to storm beaches under artillery fire, machine gun fire, eventually tanks are brought in. But by the second day of fighting, the beaches were secured and ships were being brought in massive numbers. basically beached along the shore with the front opening up, and they could unload jeeps and tanks and all kinds of supplies. You see these balloons up at the top. They were there to stop planes and different aircraft from attacking the fleet. They actually built artificial harbors and piers by sinking ships to bring in even more until they could take a larger port. So this is the awe of the D-Day invasion. They are trying to push and conquer this and basically build out of nothing something to continue the invasion. Now, there are several American soldiers who really stand out amongst those that were fighting. So you have Miguel Garcia. He had come to Texas from Mexico just before World War II looking for a better life. He had settled down in Sugarland, just outside of Houston, as a cotton farmer. On the outset of the war, Garcia joined the U.S. Army at the recruiting station in Houston. In November of 1944, Garcia, who had participated in the D-Day invasion, was in Germany leading a platoon against the Germans when they found themselves pinned down by machine gun fire. Garcia then left his platoon behind, went out and destroyed 2 enemy machine gun nests entirely on his own while wounded. He killed 6 Germans and captured 4 prisoners, all by himself while wounded. For his bravery, Garcia was awarded the Medal of Honor by Harry S. Truman himself. A month later, Garcia was trying to eat at a local restaurant in Houston. The owner wouldn't serve Mexicans, and he got into a fight and was later put on trial for this fight. So a Medal of Honor recipient was not allowed to eat in a Texas restaurant. This is a strange time. We'll talk more about civil rights movements after World War II, but this is a strange time. Audie Murphy is going to become the single most decorated soldier in World War II, and he's a Texan. So Murphy was born in Hunt County, Texas, the son of desperately poor sharecroppers. He dropped out of school in the 5th grade when his father abandoned the family, and he took a job working for $1 a day picking cotton from anyone who would hire him. His mother died when he was 15, and he had to put his youngest siblings into an orphanage to ensure their survival. When World War II began, Murphy tried to enlist, but he was rejected because he was only 16. Then his sister helped him forge some documents, so it looked like he was 18. And later, he was rejected again by the Marines for being too small. He was only 5 foot 7 inches, 145 pounds. But soon he was able to get accepted into the U.S. Army. During the war, he found himself fighting the Germans, and during a fight in southern France, Murphy's best friend went up to a German machine gun nest that was waving the surrender flag. The Germans instead killed him, and this sent Murphy into a rage. He single-handedly wiped out the German machine gun nest, killing those who had just killed his friend. And then he proceeded to use the weapons from that nest to destroy several other German positions nearby. In another fight, he held off an entire German infantry position by himself for over an hour, killing 50 Germans alone. During that time, that will win him the Medal of Honor. Overall, he won every single medal the U.S. Army could grant him. 5 of them he won more than once. He had something like 33 medals total. Belgium and France also awarded him medals for his service. Joe Medicine Crow was the last war chief of the Crow Nation and one of the last living Plains Indian war chiefs. He grew up on the Crow Indian Reservation near Lodge Grass, Montana. And after attending college and pursuing a master's degree, the war started, and he left his college program and joined the 103rd Infantry Division, fighting in World War II. Now, he completed all 4 tasks during the war to become a war chief. So he touched an enemy without killing him, which is called counting coup. He took an enemy's weapon, he led a successful war party, and he stole an enemy's horse. So to touch an enemy soldier and disarmed him, he was fighting in an area and he turned a corner and found himself face to face with a young German soldier. He knocked his gun away, ended up letting the German go when the soldier cried for his mother. But he had taken his sword and he had touched a living enemy. So the first 2 were complete. He led a successful war party when he stole 50 horses owned by the Nazi SS from a German camp while singing a traditional Crow honor song as he rode away. He received the Bronze Star Medal and the Legion d'Honneur for his service during World War II, and the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2009. Here's Obama awarding him that medal. Now you have the Battle of the Bulge. So American paratroopers were dropped in the city of Bastogne. Usually what happened is we would drop our paratroopers behind enemy lines to cause havoc, and then the army would push up and catch up with the troopers, and then they'd do it again and again. Well, the problem was at Bastogne where our troopers were dropped, the Germans pushed past that and surrounded them. So there's going to be a long, hard month or so of fighting, about 2 weeks of intense fighting, where these troops were trapped without supplies, without reinforcements, without hope for a little bit, until the US Army finally was able to break through and push the Germans back. And this is known as the Battle of the Bulge, because you can see there's kind of a bulge in that red line as the Germans pushed in. And this was cold, hard times for these paratroopers. But by this point, it's now a race to Berlin. Are the American forces and Allied forces of the British, the French, and the Americans going to get there, or the Russians? Now, Eisenhower, the American general that led all the Allied forces, he knew taking the city of Berlin was going to be a bloody fight. So he decided he would take a more steady, methodical route to Germany, to Berlin, and let the Russians get there first so the Russians could eat the worst of the damage. So he thought he was saving American lives by doing this. Now, not all generals agreed with Eisenhower. Patton tries to run ahead. He's one of the most famous generals during the war. And he actually goes so far ahead of his supply lines that his tank units run out of gas and they're trapped for several days until resupply can get to them. But nonetheless, our troops make it to Berlin. By this point, though, Berlin and Germany are out of troops. They're enlisting young men, boys really, to help fight and defend Berlin. Now, Berlin is basically bombed into oblivion. There's very little left of Berlin by the end of the war. The Soviets take the city, with the Americans following shortly thereafter. Hitler ends up committing suicide in his bunker. He and his longtime girlfriend, Eva Braun, get married, and then they commit suicide together. So not a glorious end for the Fuhrer. So there they are together with their dogs. And with the capture of Berlin and the suicide of Hitler, war in Europe is over. But the horror of the war is just being truly discovered. While everyone is celebrating the end of the war, American, British, Russian troops are finding something shocking. They're finding the Jewish concentration camps, the Holocaust camps. And they're realizing what is actually going on, what has been going on behind the scenes. And when you look at these pictures, these men and women are emaciated. They have been starved. And when the first American troops find one of these camps, their first inclination is to kick open the doors and provide food and water and everything to these starving people. But you have the medical units rush up quickly in these army units and say, no, 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 don't let them out. And this isn't a heartless act. They're saying, do not let them out, do not give them food, because if they eat too quickly and drink too quickly, that could kill them. They need to be slowly fed and slowly rehydrated so they can heal properly. So they actually keep many of these prisoners in these camps for another day, week, month, whatever it is, until adequate supplies can be provided and enough medical support can arrive to really help them heal. But these are horrific images. These people are starved, and many were executed in mass murder. So here you see some of the soldiers giving some of these prisoners some of their own food, some of their own rations. But the mass graves, the death sites, the killing sites, all of these are a shock to American troops. While the American soldiers may not have known what they were fighting for in the war, they certainly knew now what they were fighting against. So time and time again, they find more of these camps, they find more of these places. They find ovens where people were burned alive. They find experiment chambers where German scientists experimented on these Jewish people. These are wedding rings of people that had been gassed or burned alive in these camps. The Auschwitz concentration camp is one of the most horrible and notorious of the whole war. You have massive gas chambers where people were gassed in large numbers. You can see the scratches on the walls where people scratched trying to escape as they were slowly killed. Many of the nearby German communities claim to have known nothing of these concentration camps. And this often infuriated American officers because they were like, how did you not know that trainloads of people kept arriving at a camp and no one ever left, yet somehow the camp never got any bigger? So often what the US Army would have these German communities do is they were forced to march, like they basically forced everyone out of their houses and out of the town and marched them to these concentration camps to see what had been done, to force them to help with the burials. So everybody, whether they knew about it or not, is irrelevant. It was happening in their backyard and they did nothing. And this is what really angered many American soldiers. So we see this as kind of the beginning of the healing process, is these Germans having to face what was done in their country. But the war is not over. You have the war in the Pacific. And this is going to be primarily an American war, as the United States, with some British and Australian and New Zealand allies, but primarily a US invasion to retake many of these lands and to push towards the Japanese home island and try to end the second half of the war, which is the war in the Pacific with Japan. We'll stop there for today. We'll pick up with another lecture next time.